panelists with us today who all represent such a diverse area of the topic we're going to talk about today, and that, of course, is the emergence and overlapping of art, fashion, and performance. And so to introduce them, immediately to my right, we have Francesca Granata. Francesca is the director of the MA Fashion Studies program and assistant professor at Parsons. Her research centers on 20th century and contemporary virtual and material culture, with a particular focus on fashion history and theory, gender, and performance studies. Among her publications is her monograph titled Experimental Fashion, Performance Art, Carnival, and the Grotesque Body, and it examines ways in which experimental fashion of the 1980s and 90s mediated shifting gender norms and the AIDS crisis. She's also editor and founder of the nonprofit journal Fashion Projects, and prior to coming to Parsons, she taught at Goldsmiths College in NYU and held a year-long fellowship at the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Costume Institute. We have Claire Watson in the middle. Claire is the founder of Claire Watson Enterprises, a consultancy with a variety of international and individual clients. Claire also lectures and writes about collecting fashion and fashion as investment, most recently for Christie's ongoing lecture series. Corporate clients include FirstDibs.com, for which she founded First Dibs Luxury Vintage Fashion category, oversaw dealer gallery relations and sales growth, brand merchandising, production, and curation with a particular focus on fashion. Prior to launching her own firm, she worked for Doyle in New York, where she was the director for vintage couture and accessories. And last but not least, we have Mary Davis. Mary is the dean of the School of Graduate Studies at Fashion Institute of Technology and specializes in cross-disciplinary studies of fashion, music, and culture. She has written extensively about the intersections of fashion, art, and music, and her publications include the books Ballet Russes Style, Diaghilev's Dancers in Paris Fashion, Classic Chic, Music, Fashion, and Modernism, and a biography on the composer Eric Satie. Before coming to FIT, Dr. Davis was the chair of the music department at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland and associate director of the university's Baker Nord Center for the Humanities. Mary holds not one, but 3 master's degrees.
Too many.
Right. And they include the institutions of the New England Conservatory of Music, Johns Hopkins University, and Harvard University, where she also earned her PhD in musicology. So please welcome our panelists. So before we dive in and I think really center our conversation, or start our conversation with Diaghilev and the Ballet Russes, which arguably is one of the most well-known intersections of art, music, and fashion. What was going on before this intersection? How were these worlds operating? Were they distinct from each other? Were there overlaps?
Can I dive in? You can go back as far as the 18th century and find connections between music, fashion, spectacle, and visual art, all the way back. And starting in the 18th century, you can see the communication of the intersection of these spheres of expression in publications, in magazines, and in newspapers. So there's a long track record. You can go back to the court of Louis XIV. You can take the thread all the way back. I became very interested in Diaghilev and the relationship of music, fashion, and visual art at the turn of the 20th century. And a lot of people know about the Ballet Russes as an enterprise that went on from about 1909 to 1929, but you can also trace back the connections, even with Diaghilev's enterprise, to 1905 and 1906. Diaghilev actually went to Paris from St. Petersburg, where he had founded a group called the World of Art Group. Their whole idea was to do better than Richard Wagner, the great composer, had wanted to do with the creation of what he called the Gesamtkunstwerk, or the total work of art. So, Wagner put on these massive spectacles, productions of opera. Diaghilev thought he could do it better. He could do it with a Russian inflection, and so he had a group gathered around him in St. Petersburg, writers, musicians, composers, dancers, and visual artists. And they decided St. Petersburg was great, but in 1905 the place to be was Paris, so they packed up and they started to do productions in Paris. First in 1906, an art exhibition, 2 centuries of Russian art that they produced at the Salon d'Automne, which was sort of the rogue art exhibition in Paris during that time. In 1907, they came back with a series of 5 historic concerts of Russian music. In 1908, they put on the first production of Boris Godunov, Mussorgsky's great opera, ever seen in Paris. And it was in 1909 when Diaghilev thought, I know how to go one beyond what Richard Wagner ever did. I'm going to add ballet to this mix. And that's when the ballet troupe got started. That's a long digression as a starting point, but I promise we'll go forward.
That's great. So why? Why was Paris so open to Russia at this time?
Well, I can say a little bit to that because, of course, this was the period after the Franco-Prussian War, and it was between the First World War, and everyone went to Paris because of the Paris exhibition that I think was 1889 or something. So people flocked, all the creatives flocked there, and it was considered the second industrial revolution, because prior to that it was all happening in England. Oscar Wilde sort of acts as a leaping bridge between the two with Salome and Decadence and God knows what. But in the Belle Epoque, it was a flourishing for France, a very, very exciting time, and everybody who was anybody in the arts went over there. I mean, you name it, they were there, right?
Yes. We just were speaking about the Marchesa Casati, and she's such an embodiment of this coming together, I think, of performance art. You could see her a proto-performance artist, really, of fashion and, of course, art, insofar that she was not only a model, a muse, but also a patron of the arts. Yeah.
There was also a political backdrop to this, which was the Franco-Russian alliance that took place in the early part of the 20th century, late 19th and into the early 20th century. So even now, if you go to Paris and you walk across the Tsar Alexander Bridge, the Pont Alexandre, you live through that history, that alliance that brought France and Russia closer together. So Diaghilev was capitalizing on that as well.
Is this because, I think I saw this morning where Russia and Japan were fighting. Of course, the first revolution happens in 1905. So Russia goes to France to borrow money, essentially, and they try to get interest from the French in Russian culture, and this is one of the reasons why Diaghilev lands.
There's a fascinating deep history there.
No, I mean, I can't answer to the deep history, and I'm sure that's why he went, and you can answer more to that. But the point is that everyone went as well. And it's the convergence of all those disparate types and different nationalities and the different art forms all coming together at a very, very special time for France. And, they haven't forgotten it, and nor do we, of the amount of amazing things that were going on at that time. In terms of fashion, of course, we had Worth trotting over and working there, the master of haute couture, the originator of haute couture, making stuff for the Princess Eugénie. And from him, followed Poiret and some, they all worked with artists to help with their fabrics and textiles. It was just an incredible time to be there. I mean, Woody Allen said it, didn't he, when he went to, if he's done a movie there about it, it must be good.
Well, you bring up Poiret, and of course, he's so seminal in this, this emergence of Orientalism. Can we talk a bit about that and how that came about? What were some of the productions Diaghilev was working on and the composers he worked with?
So, I think the first thing to say about Paul Poiret is that he was sort of his own incarnation of Diaghilev and wanting to be an impresario in his own right. So we know him as a fashion designer, if people know him at all. He had faded a little bit from public consciousness. But he was also the first guy to design a real lifestyle enterprise in the way we know it now. So he had not only a couture business, but he had a perfume business and an interior design business as well. So you subscribe to the whole ethos of Poiret, much like you might I don't know, pick your person, be a Calvin Klein person now, or somebody who adheres to that fashion lifestyle. Poiret was also very engaged with the visual arts. He had a whole group of illustrators that he worked with who did designs for him. He was one of the first couturiers to produce luxurious catalogs of his works that were done as pochoir prints by Georges Le Pape and Paul Iribe the first 2 times around. So these things have become quite valuable collector's items. Diaghilev also worked with those artists, and so Poiret was entrenched in that whole cultural mix.
And of course, the main person that sort of we know about that worked with Poiret was this guy Raoul Dufy, who was a fabulous artist and really did a lot of the lifestyle things with the textiles all the way through the store designs with Poiret. But the thing about Poiret is that he really was an innovator and represented the era because he just decided he wanted to free women, and there was a lot going on with women at this Belle Epoque time. I'm sure you can answer to that. But no, so he was off with the corsets and very bohemian. And just in terms of collecting, I should say, I suppose, that when the Poiret auction happened in Paris in 2005, which came from his wife's collection, I mean, just unheard of, the whole world of fashion was sort of, quaking because it was so exciting. And everyone dived in there. A Raoul Dufy designed coat, velvet coat, that was on the front cover, went for $73,000. But funnily enough, just as an ad, little ad, Americanism, Africanism was also huge at that point in the Belle Epoque era, and what got the most actually was a African-inspired sort of djellaba thing, which got 125,000. So just, Dufy had his moment, but that's Poiret for you. That's a lot of money in fashion.
Yeah. And Marchesa Casati, just to return to her, it's interesting. She started, she obviously commissioned these incredible gowns for famous balls that she would host in Venice and then in Paris, where she also had this fabulous mansion. But she started being dressed by Poiret, and then the couturier weren't enough for her, so she went to Basque to get kind of more extravagant costume. She even went so far as to having a costume made of like electric lights, which...
God, very Iris Van Herpen.
Yes, in such a... And if you think about it, it was so amazing. Long ago. So it's interesting how these 3 kind of words are coming together.
Well,
but she, of course, was a woman that was trying to get out of the constrictions of her time, and she did trace to visual culture, fashion, performance, because she was like this kind of Milanese wealthy woman that was supposed to be quite live this haute bourgeoisie life, which was very constrained, but she of course broke it through, partially through performance, performing through fashion and costume.
It's interesting that you bring up the balls and parties, because they became a way of translating what was happening on stage, like with the Ballet Russes and other production companies, into the private sphere. So Poiret was also legendary for throwing these beautiful parties, outrageous parties on the grounds of his mansion in the center of Paris. One of them was an Oriental ball where he actually kept his wife. Everybody had to come in costume, and he actually kept his wife in a gilded bird cage. He was dressed as a sultan, and he only released her at the moment when he felt it was appropriate to let her go, and then the party entered its second phase. So
a very understanding wife.
So a real performance.
Yeah, real performance. Yeah, exactly.
So why do you think Diaghilev was so interested in having all of these worlds collide? What was it about him, and then how did the press respond?
Well, all I can say to that is that, we all see these marketing strategies now in a very different way, but back then it just seemed that like gravitated to like. It was a much more intuitive time. And everybody was sort of mutually inspired by one another and interested in what was new and fresh. It really was a change of, old to new. that, you know, we saw 100 years later, quite recently too, but I'm sure you have more specific response to that, but you know, it was a very intuitive time for the creative arts, I think.
Well, I think it's also worth noting that people were together. So,
Yes.
so the inspiration was not abstract or at a distance. It was people in a room like this, or in a bar, or in a salon, or at an
Montmartre.
extravagant party, who they actually all knew each other.
Yeah.
And so the transfer of ideas was just part of everyday conversation.
Yes, I suppose it was like the West Village, or, you know, used to be here, or, you know, dare I say, Williamsburg, but anyway.
I love what you just said about it being a real conversation, and I'm thinking right now of the production, The Blue Train. Because prior to this, I was looking at some of the costumes, which are very extravagant. They're almost literal in their Orientalism and very fantastical. And of course, the rite of spring and the paganism that the costumes showed. Then you've got this production called The Blue Train, which was named after the train that went from Paris to the south of France. And who do they invite to do the costumes but Chanel? And it's quote unquote real clothes. These are not costumes, it's actual swimwear. And so that blurring between fashion and costume is getting even more blurred. Can we talk about that?
Well, I think also there's a high-low element in this too, in this particular ballet, because the music is very jazzy, and the costumes, they were riffs. They weren't exactly the bathing costumes that Chanel was producing for that year, but they were designed to work on the dancers' bodies, but based on bathing costumes. Side note on Chanel in all of this. You mentioned the Rite of Spring. So Chanel was the person that helped the Ballet Russes really come back to life after World War I, when the company had really struggled. She was having an affair with Igor Stravinsky in 1920.
By the way.
No,
That helps.
This used to be a little-known fact, but 2 movies that came out made it a much more well-known fact. So she put up the money to do a revival of the Rite of Spring in 1920. They updated the costumes. Stravinsky did some fine-tuning to the music, but it brought the Ballet Russes back onto the scene, and it brought Chanel into the circle of the Ballet Russes. So then she decided that she wanted to go from just being a patron of the arts to being part of the troupe. She and Stravinsky broke up. He found another woman, and to whom he did not get married, but they stayed together forever. But Chanel basically got herself inserted into the company. She also worked with Jean Cocteau and did costumes for a remarkable production of Antigone. So she went from being a fashion designer to being somebody really working in the arts.
Wasn't some of that also to do with that she was so jealous of Schiaparelli that she wanted to also make her mark?
You had to bring that up.
Yeah, well, it's good gossip, isn't it? You know, it's juicy stuff, because really, when you look at the 2 designers and their, you know, basic DNA of design, it's Schiaparelli that has the, you know, flamboyant, artistic, experimental side, and was working with everyone and doing amazing designs. And really, it was, I felt it wasn't so true to Chanel's deeper, the way she thought about design, which was genius in its own right, of course. And I think later on, when she went to Hollywood, this also showed.
Yeah, and this is beautiful. I was going to bring up Schiaparelli and the fact that, okay, Schiaparelli and Dalí and surrealism, and she brings up what could be considered grotesque by putting a lobster on a dress and a shoe for a hat.
Do you think?
Or even that beautiful dress, which shows the kind of spinal
spine of
back,
the
which
back,
is
the
at the
skeleton.
collection at the Victoria and Albert. And I think that's very the beginning
divine.
for me, in a sense of this kind of breaking down of the body that the dress does. So what you see in a way Kawakubo or people like Leigh Bowery, of course, is just really kind of invoked already in this dress, the skeleton dress, this dress and body connection being broken down, which has been talked about a lot in relation to the Met exhibition of Kawakubo. Yeah.
And I think what we see at that period in history is all these fabulous experiments going on, and now that we take a lot of this sort of for granted. But that was sort of early experimentation in the body, and of course she was so into surrealism. And
she really invoked a kind of earlier carnivalesque practices. She did an exhibition, a show based on the Commedia dell'arte costume, so she was very aware of this. The theatricality of fashion was central to her work, right? Perhaps in a way, it was a little more subtle in Chanel.
She was witty too.
Yeah, of course. Humor was a huge part of her work.
You don't see that so much in Chanel, the wit in it.
I think that's true. Schiaparelli never worked with the Ballet Russes, but there was a production called Le Bal, which was one of the last productions done under Diaghilev with music by an Italian composer now forgotten, Vittorio Rietti, but the sets and costumes done by Giorgio Di Chirico. And Schiaparelli didn't participate in the production per se, but she translated elements of that production into her own work and sort of carried that surrealism back and forth across the stage to fashion.
Yeah, wonderful. And I'm thinking of I think I was 12 years old, and I remember seeing the Salvador Dali a suit that Schiaparelli had designed, and Salvador Dali painted fake drawers. It was very trompe-l'oeil, you remember.
Fabulous.
So suddenly women are now wearing art, quote unquote, or art is inspiring fashion collections, which is what we'll see later on in Yves Saint Laurent's work. But can we talk about that?
Well, I'm just saying you can also see a divergence there of, segmenting, in that there were people who would wear Schiaparelli and absolutely were fans, and they were probably the more flamboyant artistic types. Individuals, can one even say it, and then going off into Chanel, who really understood women, did some great stuff for them, but
She
more
streamlined the wardrobe. Yeah,
yes, and a practical wardrobe that was comfortable and define and
really based on menswear.
Yeah, inventive in its comfort. So yeah, both had every right to exist. I mean, gorgeous counterpoint starting there, and it's just grown and grown and grown since then.
And I think a point that's interesting when we think about how this connection between performance, art, fashion, music, and dance came about in the earlier part of the 20th century carried over. I feel like there is this moment and these places where there is this connection forms, and perhaps there is kind of, I'm thinking of London of the 1980s, and there is this really group of people who come together in a way. You think Leigh Bowery, Michael Clark,
Post-depression,
of course,
times.
Lucian Freud. I mean, all these disparate artists. Yes, they all come together, so there's a kind of synergy that happens that really propels this crossover or this
coming out of hard
cross-pollination.
times,
Yes.
coming after terrible, terrible depression. I mean, that was Maggie Thatcher at her highest moment in England, and these people were all poverty-stricken, and it's a sort of shame that somehow...
Not so much Lucian Freud, but yeah, the rest.
he wasn't, was he? No, he was a hack. Well, no, that's right.
Yeah, you're right.
He hung out with the poverty-stricken to get his creative juices going. Yeah, no, for sure. And it's kind of sad to think that creativity is somehow connected to this sort of constriction and, coming out of a negative thing. Yet every artist talks about that, is that they need something to bang up against. Certainly our friend Kawakubo talks about that all the time.
It's that idea of not feeling complacent. It's that idea of feeling even more emotional and reacting, anger.
Energy.
But I think they were also, more simply, in the 1980s, kind of new romantics, a lot of them were out of works, so they had a lot of time to do these creative projects, right? I mean, Leigh Bowery this performance artist, fashion designers, you name it, then musicians who collaborated with Michael Clark, who was, of course, the choreographer. He was portrayed by Lucian Freud in his famous paintings, but he was on the dole, and I think at some level he was able to, as you said, there was a point in which there was a lot of creative energy, partially because of economic circumstances, etc. going on. So there is also this particular historical moment or geographical places that create these synergies, perhaps.
Because you can hop to, but the hop to post-war Paris again, to go back to Paris, and I was sort of thinking, well, who was actually, what was really going on in sort of post-Second World War in Paris in terms of art and fashion coming together? Because obviously we know about all the new look and everything, but not so much the performance. I could only come up with Jacques Fath, I don't know, with the red shoes. I'm sure you can Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a dead zone
Yes.
in Paris. Well, I think there was in music for sure, there was a big regrouping and an effort to bring order and a rationality to things. So that was one branch, and the other was a sort of spirituality, like you see in the work of Olivier Messiaen. So on the one hand, you have Pierre Boulez systematizing everything. In fashion, it's not the most exciting time in France.
No. Which is, I guess America came into the fore then, but that's another story.
Yeah, I'm thinking of World War II happens, the men come back and they want to return to the way it was, and so women of course go back in the corsets and society balls and things like this, and I'm going to jump ahead of myself, but Yves Saint Laurent comes about,
No, but then it's Yves Saint
and
Laurent.
boom, change.
That's the boom moment.
Yeah, so we're talking 60s then, really. Yeah.
Well, and it
The
brings
60s,
us,
yeah.
Yves Saint Laurent brings us right back to the Ballet Russes, because one of his breakthrough collections was the 1976 Ballet Russe collection, where he revived some of the ideals of Orientalism and exoticism that had come out in the ballet. Then came out in 1977 with the perfume Opium, which kind of intensified that.
That photograph as well, yeah.
And in 1978 was the year that the Metropolitan Museum put on the Ballet Russe exhibition. Diana Vreeland masterminded that, and it's really the prototype for what we have now with the first Monday in May and the Met Gala, because there was a huge party and lots of celebrities. That's an issue that we really haven't touched on, the role of celebrity in all of this interconnection.
Oh God, that could be a whole conversation
Yeah.
in itself. Yeah. More relevant now, I think. I mean, to today.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And we want to jump into the 80s, but to contextualize this a little bit, the idea of how the fashion show changed, because we were talking beforehand how up until perhaps the 70s, it was a quiet room with women walking around with a number, and you would write the number down, and the store retailers would order those numbers. And then all of a sudden, correct me if I'm wrong, Halston comes along, and he elevates the runway, he puts it to music, and suddenly it's starting to become a little bit more of a performance.
To some extent, that happened in the 60s, a little bit with Mary Quaint, but certainly in the 80s, things become more spectacular and theatrical in so many realms of culture. And you're right, the fashion shows is a place where that kind of booms, no? I mean, I think of Gautier as well. He did very kind of theatrical shows. And in a way, if we think of Kawakubo, shows were a lot more toned down. Which is interesting.
Yes.
Like she was like an anti-80s figure. She was very, both her work and the way she presented the clothes was quite serious. At a time where you had a supermodel strutting down the runway, this very performative moment.
Yeah,
right?
well, it also sort of takes me a while to catch up with these conversations. But I'm also thinking of when America went over to Paris, you know, that Versailles fashion show.
Yes.
And Halston, of course, was part of that, which is what reminded me, and I think that might have been a good kickoff, because all the French couturiers came out dressed to the, you know, doing their boring, everything very stiff and bit beautiful and fabulous, luxurious. And then the Americans arrived, and everything was upbeat, and there was music, and there was dancing, and there was this and that, and the Stephen Burrows. What is that, 78?
Yeah.
That's about right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that had a big impact, because, you know, even the French were like, oh my God, this is exciting. And they actually sort of turned their back on their sort of homegrown talent, didn't they? It was huge.
Yeah, that's the thing that strikes me about the shows at that time. They're practically dancing on the runway, and then Kawakubo being almost the non-performance performance, almost a solemn march.
Well, and cerebral.
Yes.
So Kawakubo's invited her clothing still invites a kind of contemplation. You have to work to understand it. It's not bouncy and fun.
Whereas the 80s were the,
Yeah.
I mean, you think Lacroix, Montana.
Yes. The bigger the shoulder, the better.
Yes. But also even the clothes were theatrical. I mean, you think the opulence, the velvets, the brocades, there was a lot of
Le Croix.
almost costumes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, good old
Yeah.
Comme. Yeah,
Big
yeah.
shoulder pads, you know, kind of exaggerated, boxy shapes.
And that's also talking about what was happening to women at that time, in that they were entering the marketplace as workers, and this was apparently all to do with the fact that they were having to compete with men in their suits. And so, you know, for them to storm into boardrooms with huge shoulders, you know, would put men into their place instantly and give them the upper hand. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot to be said for that. It's exactly part of that era again.
And certainly performance becoming, you know, gaining its own momentum, and by the late 80s, early 90s, that runway performance is becoming so overt. I'm thinking of Margiella's first show, which is in this, on the outskirts of Paris. It's in these seemingly bombed out areas, and the models walking amongst the rubble and the neighborhood kids walking alongside the models. I'm going to read a little quote here from Ingrid Loschek, because I wonder if we can all say something about this. And she talks about why performance became so prevalent. She writes, designers use performance to bring across their intellectual message or the allure of fashionable creation, or to different elements of the creative process in a visual way. Designers search not only for creative product inventions, but also for inventive presentations that do justice to their philosophy of design and to the message of their clothing. So this idea, I'm thinking of Chilean, I'm thinking of certainly Kawakubo, but these designers, certainly Viktor and Rolf, where it's not just about the clothing, it's this kind of narrative on a stage.
Well, it's it's starting to be multifaceted and sort of multidimensional, because they're saying, if you like this, you'll like my clothes. So they're really trying to sort of self-support, as Kawakubo did with her magazine in the early 90s, Six, which she brought in all these incredible collaborators, photography, artists, you name it, without saying a thing. And, you know, tiny little Comme des Garçons in one corner, like this, like me. It was a very understated, subtle, almost subliminal marketing that we do not see today.
Yeah, and if you think about Margiela, it was all about this kind of, I mean, he used to work for Gaultier, so he was definitely kind of aware of the 1980s silhouettes, the vocabulary, and Gaultier is a great experimental designer, but of a completely different kind than Margiela. And yes, you're right, he was trying to get his aesthetic across in not only through his clothes, but also through the way he presented his clothes, his atelier, his press releases, everything was very curated to create this almost complete product.
Experience.
Yeah, complete experience, yeah.
In
a way that was very
sensation.
thoughtful.
It's trying to keep people's imaginations alive, which really from the 90s onwards, and then, you know, with the good old internet coming, has been more and more of the challenge of every designer.
But I think it's interesting because, in a way, aesthetically, I think Amy Spindler in the New York Times described this aesthetic of deconstruction fashion. She used this great quote, an asbestos suit against the bonfire of the vanities. And I feel like it was so clear. I use it all the time. It's completely kind of encapsulated.
Yeah, I often wondered about that. You know, this idea that, for example, Yves Saint Laurent got inspired from the street. I think all designers have got inspired from the street, and I think what they were picking up on was the street, and that was the start also of this, you know, the street fashion phrase that was worked in, where designers appropriated from below, as well as from above and around them. I mean, anything goes. It was their life.
Well, that was Chanel as well, who said fashion comes up from the streets.
Yep.
That was one of her pronouncements.
Yep.
This conversation also makes me think about the moment we're in now, where luxury conglomerates control so much of the landscape when it comes to fashion and art. So if you look at Prada, you know, obviously the couture and the ready-to-wear business, the perfume business, that's all part of the Prada enterprise, but so is their foundation, which is a home to contemporary art and photography. The Fondation Louis Vuitton, so Vuitton runs a number of high-end and middle brands, but also now is in the business of presenting and supporting contemporary artists. So that the blur now is really different.
I'm thinking of Tom Sachs too, of course, taking these objects and covering them with things like Hermes and Prada and making fashion art.
Right.
Yeah. Francesca, I want to talk to you a little bit because certainly we talked about the runway becoming a performance and more dance-like, and then dance, bringing in fashion designers to use their work. So I'm thinking right now, again, we were talking about Kawakubo a lot, but Kawakubo and Merce Cunningham, and I know you wrote about that.
Sure. Yeah, that was happened in 1997, and it was the dance called Scenario. And I think what I find interesting is Merce Cunningham usually uses very pared-down clothing. I mean, it's really kind of leotard, basically. So it's a very new thing for him to bring in his clothing. They're also made of stretch material, but with padding. It was based on the famous Kawakubo collection, dress meets bodies, body meets dress, which had really pronounced padding on the belly, the back, the hips. And so you see these dancers doing Merce Cunningham dances in this costume that elongated their forms and created different shape. It's almost really when you see them in motion through the dance as opposed to on the model on the runway in the previous collection, you see how it changes the body and the movement of the body. And some dancers really hated this kind of wearing them, and some really embraced it. And I feel like it was liberated. It kind of completely changed my movement. It reoriented my understanding of the body. So I feel like there is this, I thought there was a great collaboration for both because it pushed them also outside of their comfort zone in a way. I think even Merce Cunningham does not use elaborate costume. It's quite the opposite. And of course, I think it's one of the most memorable Kawakubo collections, specifically because of this very successful collaboration. I think that's one thing that, again, going back to these moments in which synergies becomes one thing that make artists, practitioners successful is this very successful collaboration. I mean, another thing that stayed with me is the way Kawakubo collaborated with Cindy Sherman at a time when Cindy Sherman was doing very grotesque imagery. So it wasn't a film stills moment, it was a later moment, and they just had so much in common in their exploration of the body, trying to push against the polished facade of these beautiful Amazon women. So it's kind of interesting how collaboration between artists, designers, and in the other case, of course, a choreographer really allows things to move forwards and the ideas to become more evident, more clear.
Well, it's that thing of that, we want to talk about, which is what this is all about, is hybrid vigor, isn't it? When you cross-pollinate across all these various art forms. Seriously, you don't know what's going to come out, and that's certainly something that Kawakubo has articulated. It's, the accidental symmetry, she called it. And it's always very exciting. I mean, you have people who just sort of keep looking inside themselves, and it can lead for a very boring, cookie-cutter fashion collection. And then you have people who really want to push it into new directions and get people to think about what it all means. Yep.
Well, I think we have time for one more question.
Really?
And then we could keep going. That said, where are we headed? What is going to happen in these three areas in the next 5-10 years? What do people want? What are people seeking?
Seriously, this is the last question with a few minutes left.
How many? Yeah, right.
Okay.
Well, should we take fashion first as a point? I think we're in a very fragile moment for fashion right now. It is a landscape where retail environments are failing, where designers are complaining about not having exactly the kind of creative freedom that we're talking about, where the pressures to produce are so intense that they can't keep up with the system. Ray Simmons leaving Dior to eventually come to Calvin Klein, where the pressures will be different but equally intense, is a poster boy for where we are in a certain sector of this industry. You have millennials who are interested in creating their own clothing, who are interested in vintage. I mean, right now it is, I think, a quite confused scene in fashion.
Well, I agree. Oh, sorry. No. I mean, I agree that it's totally confused, and sort of the big conglomerates are having to rethink how to keep up these huge profits they've been making. But I also see that it is actually a time of the individual and the individual collaborators sort of making a mark, because there's a paradox with the internet, that it's available to all, but actually, you know, an individual can find their segment and grow. It also opens up a world. And I think, you know, fashion video, we haven't, God knows, talked about that, but that certainly seems to be where, you know, YouTube and all that is just going, like the latest Kenzo thing. Absolute brilliant.
Yes. I do think, although there is definitely economics differences from the 80s and 90s insofar that there are big conglomerates in fashion that have different kind of needs for their creative practitioners. But I do think this cross-pollination between performance, art, and fashion is here to stay. I mean, you see it at the education level, you must see it too. Like, students are becoming more and more interested in working across disciplines. They don't see these divisions. I mean, they're also not in the market yet, but these divisions are not as apparent to them as they might have been even 15 years ago.
It's almost the only way.
Yeah.
When you think about it, it's actually the only way.
Yeah, they don't want to...
creating new is unexpected relationships.
Keep creating new, and I think the students are seeing that it's no longer a myopic vision. I need to bring in other people, and it's a round table, and that's how the innovation will happen.
Me.
Exactly. And they like collaborating more than the previous generations.
I think they also like being informed by other modes of expression. So being informed by visual art, by music, by literature, you know, by what's happening in the world generally. I think this will also be a key moment to see on the political front what kind of activism, what kind of reaction the current world politics will spark.
The creative arts across disciplines.
Well, and I think of a statistic, Linda Darling-Hammond out of Stanford, she's in the ed school, and she said that 50% of the most in-demand jobs today didn't exist 10 years ago. So if we think 10 years from now, we don't even know what those jobs will be because we're moving so quickly. So who's to say where we'll go? But thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, question.
Yes, we'd like to open the floor to Q&A. Oh.
It just reminds me, yesterday we had a panel in here on surrealism and the resurgence of surrealism in interest in historical surrealism, if I can put it that way, but also, you know, why would that be? Is it changing the environment? And this conversation, obviously, having some roots in surrealism, we were talking about. I'm wondering if in fashion or performance or the cross-fertilization of all these disciplines that we're talking about, you pick up any of that? Because obviously talking about surrealism today brought in our own environment. If you're saying, why is it becoming popular again? And many of the panelists said, well, we're living in a surreal world.
Yes,
you know, and that we pick up, and now we're talking about how inspiration is so often coming from the streets. You know, I don't know whether we're talking about where the world will be 5 years from now or not, but do you sense any of that in relation to your conversation?
Well, if you go back to the first use of the word surrealism that people seem to know about, it's Guillaume Apollinaire using that word to talk about a work actually done for the Ballet Russes, which is the Ballet Parade in 1917. And it's sort of, what he's indicating is something post-real, that we're in this troubled time and we're moving towards something, the art has to move towards something that goes beyond what's real. So I think, to your point, this is a prime moment for the resuscitation of that concept to feed artistic practice. I don't know what you guys think.
I think you said it perfectly.
Exactly.
Yeah. No.
I think, too, of the store Dover Street Market, simply for the reason that my students were talking about it, and they said that whenever they go to this store, they feel like a little kid. And I thought, wow, that makes a lot of sense, because the world is so challenging today, and so what does Rei Kawakubo do? But she creates this store with little tunnels and the 5 senses, and so for adults, it's an adult playground. We're escaping the outside world. So this idea of surrealism, fantasy, escapism, she does it within this one location.
Well, escapism is certainly something that, everybody wants to do right now.
She also presents it with a kind of grotesque surrealism, right? That's a little bit more challenging if you see her clothes, especially in the Met show and this Dress and Bodies collection. Or, there is another point that surrealism can be unsettling, can be uncanny, can be grotesque. And I think that perhaps goes back to the more original terms of the word, yeah.
Yes.
I have a good voice. Body art involving music, which was, nudity. And I don't know if any famous designer ever did anything with that. I know that now and then we have nudity in the Metropolitan Opera, but they're not designed, or they're not painted.
Yeah. If you think about the latest, well, they were clothed, but the latest Rick Owens collection used bodies as clothing, right? So, and he was quoting Lee Bowery, who was this hybrid fashion design performance artist who used, who did this really performances of the body in which he strapped his wife to his belly. I mean, there were beautiful photos of it by Fergus Greer and others. So, and he covered himself in clothing and then gave birth to his wife. So there is definitely, again, like in this area of performance and at the margins of fashion, is interest in exploring the borders of the bodies. Because if you think about both performance and fashion, what do have in common? This really close connection to the body.
I'm curious, it's totally selfish, because I produced for the first time a show with live calligraphy and partial nudity. And it was an offer to the public, actually, and experimental music at the same time. It was a public performance.
If your question is including experimental music, I don't actually have a sort of quick answer for that. But of course, you said Yves Klein as well, and in terms of body and art.
Well, and I think it's also...
Probably had music in the background.
It's also interesting to go beyond Western culture to think about music and the body, because that is just a feature in many cultures, in Bali, in Africa, to adorn the body in ways that will create musical sound.
I'm thinking of the Viktor and Rolf show too, where their kind of design problem to solve, if you will, was they wanted to hear fashion first before they saw it. So they used little bells as their quote-unquote new embroidery. So they covered these garments in little Swiss bells, filled the space with smog, a fog machine, and they emerged from the fog. It was quite beautiful.
That's like the McQueen for Bjork piece. Yeah, for her video, right?
Yeah, exactly.
65,000.
Thanks. Hi, may I ask a question about like artists and the fashion brand collaboration? What do you think about and Jeff Koons and Louis Vuitton? Just very curious about your idea about this.
Who wants to jump into this?
I don't find that to be I think there could be a really lot of interesting collaboration. I didn't find that to be as interesting to me. It seemed a little too literal, but I mean, you have the opposite view, so.
Well, no, I mean, I'm all for anything, and I'm quite happy that my original thought might be, and then I sort of open up my mind and think, okay, well, let's see what comes of this, because that's the point of collaboration. We might know one in situ and the other person in situ, but what we don't know is what they're actually going to do when they come together. And it can be obvious, in which case one can say it's an unexciting, possibly failed collaboration, but where you get real interesting genius is when that produces the unexpected, something new from the two of them.
So I'm going to offer a differing view, which is I find the whole thing to be very commercial and uninspired, and I think it goes back to the luxury conglomerate business. This is a way of putting two people together or two enterprises together that is a little bit kitschy and meant to generate revenue. So I'm not a fan.
Well, but since the moment it did start generating revenue back in the day, I mean, Marc Jacobs is the one that I really, I woke up then. with Louis Vuitton, and even before with Stephen Sprouse. I mean, yes, they all looked at it and thought, okay, we've got to sort of make this, evolve this idea. I think the point you're making is that now it's sort of horribly strategic and mentally thought out, rather than being organic, which it was in the Belle Époque. But still, you can, that's the point though, still you can get some unexpected and very new, fabulous, inspirational things that really make you wake up and feel. Which is the point of art.
Yeah, and I think to underscore that, there can be a lot of creativity due to naivete. That is to say, I'm thinking of a friend of mine who's a fashion designer, and her husband is a fine artist, and she'll be working on the pattern making table, and she'll be trying to work through something. And because he doesn't have that vocabulary, he'll just come in and say, well, why can't you do it this way?
Right.
And suddenly it breaks her assumptions in a really wonderful way.
Yeah.
And the technology of the iPhone had been around for years until someone, Steve Jobs, came along and said, let's put it all together in this one device. So if it creates that kind of synergy, that innovation.
And friction.
Yeah.
Yes.
Both, yeah.
Imperfection. The beauty of imperfection.
Thank you. Just out of curiosity, I would like to know your opinion on eco-design, which seems to be the new incoming trend, talking about the future in the next 5 or 10 years. Thank you.
Yes, sustainability, again, from the student perspective, this is something that the students that we see they're completely focused on. This is just a foundational aspect of what they want to do in fashion. And it branches out into all different areas. So there's the idea of sustainability in design, making things that are wearable repeatedly, but there's also sustainability in the supply chain, where you're getting everything from how that stuff is being transported to create the garment. And finally, the issue of sustainability of workers and giving people a fair wage. The Ethical Fashion Initiative, which is part of the United Nations, has been very key to taking up that leg of the effort.
Yeah, it's funny, about 8 years ago, I curated this exhibition called Ethics and Aesthetics, which was about sustainable fashion. I think it's all true, but it's also, there is something to be said about the aesthetics of fashion being part of this, insofar that, like, you want good product that are well made, that will last, and not fast fashion, to really get over the hurdle of overconsumption. Yeah.
I'm thinking of, I teach in the fashion design program at Parsons, and so historically we would have these separate discrete courses in sustainability, ethical business practices, and so on and so forth. Now we have a new dean, Barak Chakmak, and sustainability learning outcomes are embedded in all of the courses. And so those separately discrete courses that we once offered will be off the table, because everything we do will be sustainably motivated. It's going to become the default. It's almost like saying, well, we're teaching fashion design, so we're going to have a class in fabric. No, it'll be understood.
And also, just from my perspective, having been in the vintage fashion business for so long, I mean, that's one of the key elements in the growth of popularity in vintage fashion is, using the secondary market as a source of individual style, one's fashion, putting together, doing your own personal collaborations, old, new, existing, something that's modern, and just putting it all together. It's just there. It's here to stay.